where do you see the future of media?
When Arnav was arrested, I tweeted to say
I have friends on the right wing. I would stand with them because they're my friends.
that the media is a divided house is not true.
When it is Islamist terror, you call it by its name and you call it that.
Hello everyone, welcome to The Churn. I hope you've been enjoying our videos. I also hope that you have been able to engage with ideas that we try and bring across here at The Churn. If you haven't yet, do subscribe to our channel and spread the word in your network. I don't have any sponsors and don't depend on any funder to help me curate these conversations and bring them across to you. You can help me grow only by an organic outreach in your networks. Today in conversation, we have two senior journalists who have been in the media industry for more than 3 decades now. Veer Sanghvi started off with print and moved to television, and Barkha Dutt has been a household name in TV journalism. Today, she runs her own enterprise, The Mojo. Welcome, Veer, and welcome, Barkha, to The Churn. Really thankful that both of you agreed to do this.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pleasure.
Both of you have been senior journalists now, and you've covered Indian politics. Veer has covered, obviously, food for a very long time and politics as well. How do you see this graph of Indian media, which really took up huge plunge forward from print to electronic to digital, and now perhaps OTT as well? Veer, can we begin with you?
Barkha, you want Barkha to start or you want me to start?
I think
You
let's
start.
not be polite. You shouldn't be polite between, sandwich between two women.
Okay,
You can
okay. I'll start and then Barkha, who's a different generation, can supplement it. I started out in print media, and all the time I was in print, we were conscious of the fact that our newspapers and our magazines were never very good. I mean, India Today, which I started my career with, was a very good magazine in Indian context. But no, it wasn't anywhere near Time Magazine or Newsweek in those days. It had 100 of the resources. I moved to newspapers, and as good as our newspapers tried to be, I don't think any serious person would compare any Indian newspaper to, say, the New York Times or whatever. All that changes, I think, when the first news channels come out, because they're very sophisticated. Many of them are of international quality. If you look at, say, NDTV in the heyday of Barkha and people like that, it was, I thought, an international quality news channel, and it left many of us in the print media a little lost. We didn't know what to do. We weren't sure how to compete. I mean, there was a time when India Today, I think, had set the agenda in the 90s. I think from 2000 to 2008 or so, it was NDTV that set the agenda. But while we were struggling, and even then, NDTV and all the other channels, as good as they were, had nothing like the resources of the great American networks or even the BBC. It was really a struggle. It was individuals achieving things that American journalists would have never thought possible, only because of their hard work, their talent, and a certain amount of jugaad. You've now entered the world of streaming, the world of OTT and stuff, the world of things like Barkha's doing, like the Mojo. And now it's a level playing field. I think it's very hard to argue that a good streaming platform in India is in any way 10 years behind or in any way not as good as an international platform. So I think for the first time, the Indian media is on a level playing field with the rest of the world. That's my take. Barkha, you know.
And my take is not that different, actually, especially as someone who studied journalism in New York and had the opportunity to actually stay back and work in American media. Today, some days I feel I made a mistake by not doing that. They're just delightfully professional newsrooms, and there is slightly a tinge of remorse or regret in me for not having taken that route. But I do believe that technology, as Veer mentioned, has made it possible today, with not necessarily mammoth resources, to be world class. I think for the first time, one feels that without a lot of money, just on the power of reporting and a certain kind of sort of acquired understanding of production, if you weld the two, you can actually be world class. I don't think actually the same can be said for Indian television anymore. And that is the tragedy. I think somewhere Indian television lost its mojo, pun fully intended. And I'm here to reclaim that.
Barkha, one cannot take away the fact that the kind of reporting that you did during these troubled times, during COVID, you were out on the streets, bringing out real stories from the ground about normal people who faced extreme difficulties. I think that really, and prior to you joining in, Veer and I were discussing, and he actually made a very interesting remark that it changed the way digital platforms have been covering news. And I think it's very true because for the first time we saw stories about common men and women who reflected on screen. Um, why do you think the Indian media, and not I'm not going to cover only post 2013. Let's consider it from whenever we would want to cover it from the day Indian media actually became more electronic and less print, and obviously now it's digital. Where do you think we lost the touch to cover stories about common men? Is it when advertising took over and when advertisers started sitting in the newsrooms? When actually did that happen?
It's a very interesting question. I always say the Indian media had to battle three tyrannies that I have observed in my lifetime. The first is the tyranny of the state, which is state-owned media. Doesn't matter which party, any government, if it could, would want to control the media. Then came the tyranny of the market, which is advertisers basically determining what your audiences should be targeted for, and therefore definitely having a say in your content. And today, while we are freer in the digital world, we battle the tyranny of the algorithm. If our headlines are not clever, if they're not catchy, if they don't hook people in, if we can't make someone click on our links, then we are not watched. So it's not as if the digital space is completely and totally free from the pressures of getting an audience. But the difference is that because it takes relatively less capital to create content on digital platforms and amplify it, our revenue model is not broken in the way that TV News's revenue model is broken. It takes them so much money to do the same thing that we are able to do on the digital platform, that they want to do the cheapest possible version of content. So one, talk is cheaper. So they just assemble 3 or 4 of the same people that they used to and they make them talk. And the second thing is their advertiser will say, "Isme our audience is not interested." So, for example, if you're an English channel and you want to reach a certain kind of elite class, you'll say, "Arey, tum kitna gareeb aadmi ka story dikhaoge? Tumhara audience is not interested. Your audience will move away." So there will be that subliminal pressure of what the advertiser and your target audience may feel. And I think that the magic of digital is, in fact, I'll give you an example. It used to take 13 people in the back end for me to do 60 minutes of prime time on TV. I'm able to do that with 2 people today, and with no discernible difference in the quality of production, because I still care about that. I'm trained in that. I care very much about, my graphics looking a certain, at least a clean look. Maybe I won't have like everything that television can have, but I will have a reasonably professional look. And it will take me 2 people versus 13 people in television to produce those 60 minutes.
Sure. Veer, do you have a different take, or do you agree with what she just said, or would you want to add something to it?
I'll add a bit, which is that advertisers, I think, get things very wrong. I was last week on one of these seminars with Sam Balsara of Madison, who's one of the pioneers of advertising in television. And he was quite honest about the attitude advertisers had. And he said, our attitude is we want big numbers. He conceded this meant that people went for the lowest common denominator, and therefore quality was sacrificed. But he said, that's what the game is about. And in the context of newspapers, even if they're giving away newspapers for free, I don't care. We've got circulation. Now, Sam is, of course, a veteran of the industry and a doyen, but I have a slightly different view, which is that when it comes to newspapers, if you think you're going to get circulation or readership by people who are paying 50 paisa for a newspaper who are getting it free, I think you've made a huge mistake. And I think the Indian newspaper industry, led by the Times of India from the 90s onwards, has made the same mistake. The economy of all newspapers around the world is usually 50% subscription, subsidized by around 50% advertising. In India, it's pretty much about nearly 100% advertising. So you are then an extension of the advertiser. You cease to be news media. They make the same mistake, I think, when it comes to television. If you look at the figures, Baka's probably better at this than I am. The share of English news is between 0.1 to sometimes 0.2% of the total television universe. When you're looking at that, you realize A, that if you can pay a few people in some households to watch a little bit of television or keep their TV sets on when they're out, your figures are going to be massively inflated. So the potential for rigging is always there. Besides, even if these figures are not rigged, when you're dealing with such tiny, infinitesimal quantities, should you worry so much about numbers? Because the numbers don't mean so much. Shouldn't you care a bit more about quality? Shouldn't you, like they do in America, care about demographics, try and understand who's watching the show? Are there people advertisers want? Now, regrettably, Indian advertisers don't do this enough. So when Barkha talks about the tyranny of the market, it's not just the market. It's a market that's focused on big numbers and therefore a market that artificially inflates the need for lowest common denominator content. And because costs in television are relatively high, though these days they tend not to be high because all you need to run a television channel is one very hard-working desk, one very loud anchor, and 16 people on Zoom. So that doesn't cost that much money. But the OTT platforms, which don't need as much advertising as television channels do, because as Barka's pointed out, their costs are lower, don't need to cater to the lowest common denominator. Yes, there's some element of clickbait, there's some element of beating the algorithm, but generally we're on OTT platforms, so it's a good thing to say. We are essentially, when we talk about good quality content, it's on things like this. Could we have had this discussion on Indian television? Would anyone have even given us the time of day? I doubt it.
Barkha, but both of you have been in media for so long, and both of you have been a part of electronic media as well. We all identify the problems with, for example, where we left on, the problem with conversations and how either polarized it is or too ideological it is. Why did anchors like you, why did you not step in to say, well, this is wrong? As a community, why didn't media houses come together or journalists came together to take a call?
So, I mean, there are lots of different questions in that question of yours. Uh, Anchors like myself did have many arguments where I worked, which is why I reached a point where I could no longer work where I worked. If I saw eye to eye with my promoters, I would not have maybe had the courage to branch off on my own. The truth of the matter is that I was becoming an increasing misfit in my own industry. I have to recognize what happened to me, right? So it's not true to say that one didn't argue, one didn't resist, one resisted a lot, one argued a lot, maybe one argued more than one should have. That would generally be the reputation I would have in the industry. So that's the first point. The second point is that the Indian media is an extremely bitter, divided house. Nobody likes anyone. Nobody has a good word to say about anyone. People like Veer are quite rare in the generosity with which they shower praise on colleagues. I think there are very few people who are willing to praise a colleague, willing to mentor somebody younger. And this is what has done us in. What has done us in is a complete colossal clash of egos, clash of personalities. I cannot remember an issue on which journalists have stood together. If anything, there's such schadenfreude, such delight at someone else going through a tough time, or even enabling that tough time. So that's the second point. And the third point is that, look, as long as we're employees, there's only so far that we can take a position, right? At some point, so take my case, for example, I think as someone in my 20s or 30s, NDTV was a fantastic place for me, right? I think that sort of benevolent way, the way the newsroom was run was great for me. But the moment I grew up and I had views of my own, there was an immediate clash. So I think a point also comes in your life where people like myself have had to put my money where my mouth is. If I feel so strongly that I can do it differently, I have to be able to show that. I can't keep working for someone else and keep on arguing with them about how they're running their place, right?
Veer, And from here on, I think the conversation is going to get where we wanted the conversation to be.
Tell me, what exactly are you asking?
No, Barkha talked about, I mean, and I think all of us would agree on that, right? What happened to the Indian media, the clash of egos and all of that. Now, we know that Arnab is in jail. We know that there will be a lot of disagreements with his style of journalism and all of that. But shouldn't the Indian media would have stood up for him, like they perhaps, I'm drawing a completely different parallel. What if Abhisar Sharma was dragged from his collar, or Punya Prasoon Bajpayee was dragged from his collar, from his house, without even shoes on, and dragged to jail? Would the Indian media in general, the way it's perceived, would have reacted differently? Do you think there would have been a
Well,
different kind of
I can
reaction?
only answer that question for myself, which is when the police got involved in the investigation into Park, I said this was a very bad precedent because the police should not be involved in things to do with the media. Of course, I can understand the argument they gave, that's criminal complaint, we had no choice. When Arnab was arrested, I tweeted to say that I didn't think he should be arrested. And I tweeted yesterday, and I've since got thousands of hate mail messages, that it is absurd to keep Arnab in jail. He should have been given bail immediately. Bail should always be the rule. As Krishna Iyer said, jail is the exception. Now, I've had lots of whataboutery and people saying to me, what about so-and-so, what about so-and-so, how come they were not? I mean, the answer to that is the principle is valid. The principle is that bail should be the rule, whether it's Arnab or whether it's somebody else. To say that somebody else who was not so well connected would not have got bail, so why should Arnab get bail, is nonsense. The principle is valid for everybody. So your question about should the media stand together or not, I have. And many people on Twitter seem to find this out, stood up for Arnab.
Barkha?
See, I think the assumption that Abhisar would have evoked one reaction and Arnab evokes the other is based on your assumption that people like myself, who said nothing about this case till this moment, are doing this because of some left and right thing. Really, it is not about that at all. This has nothing to do with who is a liberal and who is a right winger. The reason that I wouldn't spend 1 minute of energy standing up for Arnab is because I have lost count of the number of times he has obsessively taken some photograph of Hafiz Saeed and called me some Hafiz Saeed ka journalist, right? Just to give you one example of the many different ways in which he has vilified me. I don't watch TV, but they get shared on Twitter or I get tagged on Twitter, so I get to know. Why should I care? I don't care. I don't care to stand up for someone who has not shown the basic professional respect to another human being. The principle that Veer is elucidating, I'm very happy to support the principle. Should bail be the exception, as I beg your pardon, the norm rather than the exception? Absolutely. But am I going to spend 2 minutes of my day making that point about an individual who has basically not shown that courtesy to millions of other people? I'm not going to spend that time. It doesn't mean that I disagree with the principle behind it. I'm just not interested. I'm not interested enough in Arnab.
Barkha, what you say, I mean, one can personally perhaps empathize with your situation that you were personally vilified and therefore you don't want to take a chance. But when it comes to larger issues of liberalism, when it comes to, because you and I can have a conversation over a phone call as well. But in the world of social media, when you are actually seen through what you write, what you don't write, through the kind of comments that you make on a particular day when something like that is happening, how would you respond to the charges of you being a liberal, which I think should not be taken as an abuse? It's liberal, conservative, right, left. These are all traits of opinion that you have. As a liberal, do you feel not standing up for cases like this will set a wrong precedent in the coming times? Because I think we have hit a slippery slope with this episode. This is my opinion.
Okay, so first let me respond to how I see myself. I find that one of the reasons that I alienate people, certainly the right wing doesn't like me, but I often alienate people on the left, is because there is no sticker you can put on the box in which you put me. There isn't one, and my views are far too complicated. I cut my teeth as a young reporter reporting on the military. I have great sort of great sentimentalism, for example. Just to give you one example where I've often clashed with my friends on the left, right? And so they find me somewhat of a jingoist, and for the right wing, I'm somewhat of some treacherous sort of softball liberal, right? So these labels are meaningless. I think there are many of us. I mean, I think Veer is similar in that way, who make up our minds on issues, on people, on moments, on and sometimes on friendships. I have friends on the right wing. I would stand with them because they're my friends, right? You have to understand that there are many things that make up a human response, and something abstract like why aren't you standing up for the principle? I think that India we left unfortunately behind long back. We now live in an extremely coarsened, vicious sort of age. It's each woman for herself, each man for himself. And I think everybody is just hunkering down and trying to breathe and survive and thrive in their corners while still being loyal to the few people that they care about and the few principles that are very sacred to them. And I don't think I've compromised on those two things.
Veer, I would want you to comment on something which perhaps both of you have never on a platform like this together. Both of you were involved in controversies, and I've been fortunate enough to hear both sides of the stories from both of you individually. I'm talking about the Radia tapes. Now, Veer, I'm not going to get into the details of what happened, why you feel you are innocent, why Barkha feels she's innocent, because I think a lot of time has passed since that episode happened. What do you think fundamentally changed with that episode in Indian media? Do you feel anything changed, or it is business as usual?
Nothing changed. So you're saying I don't want you to say why you're innocent, which is a little like saying we've convicted you. Now tell me if you have any last wishes.
No,
I think
no.
both Barkha and I think you're going to have to, now that you've raised the
Sure,
the
please.
mouse in the room, I think you're going to have to let me answer it.
Sure.
These so-called transcripts were circulating for a long time by a corporate house. No newspaper, no magazine agreed to carry them. This was broken by Open magazine, which carried the transcripts. Open was not a significant publication at that stage. Nobody cared. The transcripts had also been with Outlook magazine, where Vinod Mehta was a very old friend of mine, and is used to be a man of principle, refused to carry them. He felt enormous pressure after the Open exposure. He carried them, and he ran on the headline stuff that I think was this probably written after 6 drinks, like the 2G tapes, and they lobbied for what was the name, Raja's inclusion, etc. None of which was even supported by the tapes or the transcripts that he carried. I went and saw him, and I said, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "Yeah, we got the tapes. Everybody else is doing it. You write a rejoinder now." So I said, "I don't think that's enough. I think you should know first of all that these tapes are bogus." He said, "Yeah, I have said I have not verified them." So I said, "Now that you've carried them, don't you feel an obligation to verify them?" So he said, "No, you verify them." So I went off and I got 4 laboratories in the United States, which were used by the FBI and police departments, and 1 in the UK to test those tapes. All of them said that the audio had been manipulated. In the case of 1 tape, the audio had been manipulated so much that it no longer sounded like my voice on a machine, on a spectrometer, on a sound meter. I went back to Vinod Mehta. I said, "These are the results of the test." He said, "I'll carry them." So he carried them, to his credit, and they were out in the public domain. So I said, "Now that you know that your tapes were bogus and you know that the allegations you made were unfounded, don't you think you should say you regret carrying it?" So he said, "No, I never apologized." So I sued, and they did every trick possible to try and delay the trick. Eventually, we got a judgment, and I was being cross-examined, and the magistrate said to the lawyer cross-examining me that you're not going to get anywhere with this. Why don't you just settle? So we had a court-appointed process. We settled. They withdrew all the allegations they made, and they said they regretted carrying the story. Now, given that this happened, what can I say? Well, one, that I was very naive at the time. I believed that if the corporate battle and allegations were made unsubstantiated by some business person to try and do down some other business person, journalists would not pay much attention. I was wrong. I believed also in those days, those were the early days of Twitter. So all of us believed that if we read something on Twitter, some real person had done it. We know now how troll farms work, how IT cells work. And I went back later after I learned all this to look at those handles. Most have since disappeared. Some of them were handles set up only to do this. So I learned then how easy it is. We're now talking about 2010. How easy it is then to manufacture a controversy, to create something on social media. And that's a lesson that stayed with me because we see it happening every month now. So, in answer to your question, what changed? Well, I became less naive.
Can I just add? I mean, I think we just said everything for on this, but I want to add one thing. I was noticing in Hathras recently that a young reporter who I thought did some very good work on the ground. So this is really not about her. Her conversation was recorded by somebody and it was leaked online, right? And how apoplectic the channel was about how their reporter's privacy had been violated. The same channel, and I'm talking about India Today, I'm happy to name names, I have no coyness. The same channel used WhatsApp conversations of Riya Chakravarti to cover a story, yeah, to make some point, whatever point they were trying to make. This same channel was at the forefront of covering the Radia tapes with not a thought about privacy, private conversations. If the principle the journalists took at the time was that all conversations, no matter how they can be manipulated, distorted, edited, selectively, decontextualized, should be placed in the public domain and let the public sort of perform a town square kind of assessment of them, then I just found it astonishing, the staggering hypocrisy with which now there was so much outrage that, oh my God, somebody has actually put in the public domain a conversation a reporter had with a source. I thought journalists had made that par for the course with Radia tapes. Now, I don't see any journalists volunteering their conversations or their WhatsApp exchanges in the public domain. The Radia tapes was not just a corporate-driven controversy. It was partly that. It was also a way for colleagues in the media to settle scores with journalists who made them insecure. And that is the elephant in the room. It was something that media did to itself, and it has forever lost the right now to complain about a violation of privacy or to ask for it.
So let me ask you this question. So when there are these conversations about how media is in danger today, and you say media is a divided house, and we all know, I mean, it's no brainer to see that media is a divided house, and not just because the conversation that we are having right now, but the kind of conversations we have on social media, generally in drawing rooms and all of that. We all know how media houses are labeled, how journalists are labeled, and one subscribes to each other's ideologies according to whatever they think is right. In that situation, Barkha, is it right to say that media is in danger when some journalist is attacked by one political party and the other by the other political party? Since we are not talking about principles here, is it also right to say that today there is no media house in the country, there are no journalists in the country, they're actually part of a corporate organization, and all of them are businessmen in their own right. Some are small retailers and some are the big ones. Would you take it that far, and would you like to comment on it? Veer, can we go? I think Barkha's video is stuck.
I'll just add one thing, which is
I'm back and I kind of missed the end of that.
Sure.
Okay, I'll do a line. I'll do a line to just qualify your point.
Hi.
Which is that I agree with Barkha on nearly everything actually every single thing she said. But I think we need to make the point that it's not just the media attacking the media. This trend started around 2000, 2009, and it started from political parties. It was political parties and their IT cells that started abusing journalists, that started trying to intimidate anybody who wrote an article. Many people in the media who were enthralled to those political parties and later to other political parties picked up that lead from social media. So to say that the media is a divided house is not true. The country is a divided house, and the government and other political parties set out to deliberately target journalists who did not agree with them.
When you say 2009, can you elaborate what exactly happened in 2009?
No, I'm giving you a rough time. What happened in 2009 was when the growth of Twitter and other social media became important. From 2009 onwards, people started running on their screens what people had said on Twitter, not realizing that these hundreds of tweets were actually done by two guys sitting in a troll farm somewhere and writing them to a pre-arranged script. That is when the mainstream media gave Twitter and social media that degree of credibility. It got a further boost in 2010, and then it continued pretty much till 2014. It increased, we forget this, but one person who used the social media platform very effectively was Arvind Kejriwal. We keep talking about Amit Shah and Amit Malavia, but that whole business of that's so-called hilariously called India against corruption was really created with social media manipulation and with the active connivance of television channels. At no given time were there more than a few thousand people all over India who demonstrated over part of this India against corruption rally or platform. Yet, between social media and sympathetic television channels, this was magnified and called a second freedom movement. Many channels even called Anna Hazare, remember him? The new Gandhi. So that's why I'm saying 2009.
Barkha?
Um, I do think that the one thing that Veer said that leapt out at me was that the country is a divided house, right? And the media is reflecting those divisions. I don't think it should. I think we need to step back and actually acknowledge that we are not institutionally free. Let's take something that happened in the US right now. I was fascinated by it. I don't know that I would have done it. I don't even know that I agree with it. But that networks tuned Trump out, right? American networks just stopped broadcasting Trump because they said he was lying. Now, my preferred way would have been to carry the speech and then, in an ideal world, fact check it. But where do we even do that with our heads of state? It doesn't matter which party they're from. We have such a cultural sort of acceptance of positions of power, not the individuals necessarily in them, but what those posts represent, right? We think, oh, we do not disrespect this post. We are not truly free. We're an evolving democracy, and where we finally settle down on the democracy scale is not clear to me yet, because the media as an institution is not free in the way that the American media is. It's just not. Our roots are not as deep. We don't have anything like the First Amendment that we really believe in, that nobody can, mess with. I mean, Trump can hate the media, but he has no option but to engage with it. And look at the power dynamic in a White House press briefing. The president stands, the media sits. This is unimaginable in India. It is unimaginable, right? So I do think that two things have happened with the media. One is reflecting the politics of polarization, or the polarized polity rather, and the second is that because media houses are owned by business houses and business houses need governments to survive, you will not have that kind of institutional freedom. By contrast, Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, where I write a column, cannot dictate the post. And Jeff Bezos will buy the paper, accepting that as his Lakshman Rekha. This is not imaginable in India. It is not possible.
Veer, do you think what Barkha is talking about is also related again? And we go back to our previous conversation on commerce, on how actually media houses, the model of the media houses, the way they are run, corporate interference. Let me ask you a question from a futuristic point of view. Where do you see the future of media amidst all these realities that exist, amidst all these uncomfortable truths that we are living with?
I think that India cannot be an exception. Just as I said, we are now on par with the rest of the world. I think our future in India will be the future of the media and the rest of the world. You just have to look at the West to get some basic lessons. The first is that advertising to newspapers has dried up. The ones that have survived or are doing well are the ones that have dedicated subscription bases, both for the physical paper and on the internet. Indian newspapers will find this more difficult to do because we have cheapened news to the extent that Indians are unwilling to pay for it. We haven't understood how to sell the newspaper to subscribers. We haven't even understood our core subscriber in our giving away of newspapers and our chasing these mythical big numbers. Second, television, including news television in America, is a dying beast. It doesn't appear like that because the numbers are still not bad and the profits are still there for Fox and for CNN. But if you look at the demographics and you look at the age of people who watch CNN and people who watch Fox, it's generally people over 50, often over 60. And if you watch the American feed, you can tell because all the ads are for wheelchairs and adult diapers and stuff like that. There is clear evidence in America that the young will not watch network television or even cable television. We cannot, in the long run or even in the medium run, be an exception to that. The power that television holds over us, and particularly during the pandemic when we have nothing to do and therefore watch television in the hope of some entertainment, will not last. The future is platforms like the two of you run. The future is much more diverse than anything we've seen before. It's people watching things, perhaps paying for them, but almost certainly paying for them, that they believe gives them the truth, that they believe represents some kind of quality journalism. If that does happen, then I think media as we know it now will not exist 10 years from now. It'll be a complete different landscape.
The final question that I have for both of you is with respect to what we saw in France, in fact, the rest of the Europe as well. I think, Barkha, it's not just our country that's a divided house. I think globally, we are reaching at a point where there would be very difficult cultural conversations that perhaps the liberals and the conservatives wouldn't want to see eye to eye when they talk about it. Now, what happened in France, we all know was wrong. But the way in which protests started off in India, and somehow the loosely defined grand liberal community in India did not stand up and say that's what's happening in India is wrong. I think that that did not send a good message, especially to the millennial generations who are often taught to be secular in a certain way. Where do you stand on this? Because this has a larger implication on the conversation on polarization that we were talking about.
So, I mean, I think you're talking to two people who've actually taken a pretty clear position on this. I did a show on the Mojo. Veer was one of my guests. Veer was one of the first people to call this out, to say that when it is Islamist terror, you have to call it by its name. And I agree with that. And I also have spoken to any number of Indian Muslims who also agree with that. So what it makes me wonder is, who are these people who are protesting? Who are these people who are on the street, and who are they speaking for, and who do they represent? Because literally every single Indian Muslim I have spoken to, and maybe you could argue that I'm in some little bubble and I know only a certain kind of, PLU people like us, but whoever I have spoken to, Muslim by faith, self-identifies as Muslim, is more horrified than the three of us, because this is happening in the name of her or his religion, right? So I think that the position really it's not rocket science. There is, when it is Islamist terror, you call it by its name and you call it that. Equally, when there is, let's say, a Pragya and a Malegaon blast case, and there is the deployment of hardline Hindutva to contextualize violence, you call it by its name. When there is, Christian Christianity distorted to perform an act of violence or terror, you call it by its name. So I am all for burying the cliche, terror has no religion. Terror sometimes does have a religion. Just call it whatever religion it is in that context. Is there more of Islamist terror in the world today than the other religions that I have named? Yes. Should that be used as a basis to judge Muslims who have nothing to do with this? No. It's actually quite simple.
Veer, the reason why I asked this question was because often when we have these informal conversations, we actually talking about extremism on many different sides of the political spectrum and ideological spectrum. Now, I ask this question because whenever there is an act of terror committed by self-professed Hindu groups, I think there are a lot of us who stand up on social media and say that it is wrong. Unfortunately, apart from, exceptions like perhaps Barkha and you who discussed it on a particular show, we don't see that kind of solidarity in the public domain from Indian Muslims or from people who should actually stand up and say that it's wrong. Why do you think that that happens, and where do you see the future? Because unless we are ready to accept and look at truth in the eye, I don't think we are going to make a headway. Because all said and done, let me please add, because it's an emotional issue for me as well. All said and done, when Tanishq comes up with an ad, and most of us, even I, react to it. It's not because I intrinsically believe that Tanishq is anti-Muslim, sorry, anti-Hindu. It is because they condone certain forms of representation, visual representation, that one is forced to take a position. For example, the recent Diwali ad that they shouldn't have come up with an injunction like, well, I'm not going to, burst firecrackers. These days, after 10, once a child reaches 10 years of age, they don't even listen to their own parents whether you need to burst crackers, watch television or not watch television. So this kind of moral lesson coming from corporate houses and organizations like these, in the name of faith, I think that really irks up, and people do feel offended. And they have as much of a right to feel offended as Tanishq, or for that matter, anybody has a right to make a cartoon or make an ad.
Okay, there are three separate instances, about 1,000 different questions in the little speech. Let's start to deal with them bit by bit. Let's start with the first one, which is the stuff about Muslims not condoning this. I wrote a piece which Barkha referred to, I think on the day that the Nice attacks happened, saying call it Islamist terror and condemn it. And I got many people on what you would call perhaps the right wing, for whatever that means, saying what a wonderful piece, but how come Muslims don't agree with you? And the next day there would be shots of little groups of extremist Muslims who protested, say this is the view of the average Muslim. Then there was a statement issued by many people, of whom I think 50 out of 130 or so were Muslims. And I put that on my Twitter feed and I said, you see, it's not true. And then I got responses, hey, Javed Akhtar has signed it. He's an atheist. How can you call him a Muslim? So basically, when he says something you don't like, he's a Muslim. When he says something you have to like, he's an atheist. So I question this whole assumption that Muslims do not condemn it. I think that's wrong. I think that is a mischaracterization of the community. I'm sure some people at the low echelons, poorer people, less educated people, are on the side of the extremists. Frankly, that's true of Hindus on the side of extremists as well. The point is, unfortunately, that we live in an era where television debates and stuff like that in social media is tailored to caricature the Muslim as being this kind of illiterate, violent, jihadi fundamentalist. You go on to television debates, and most decent Muslims no longer appear on many channels, obvious reasons. So you have people you've never heard of, people who nobody in the Muslim community even knows, who come up and say outrageous things. And then they're the equivalent, I would say, of Pakistani generals on some of these channels. They're there only so that the anchor can shout at them and we can take the line that this is the voice of Indian Islam. It's not the voice of Indian Islam. I don't think the voice of Indian Islam is pro-terror, and I resent the implication that it is. On the Tanishq ad, I didn't find it at all offensive, nor did anybody I know. I can understand, and I sympathize with your right to find it offensive. But sorry, I mean, Tanishq is not in the business of not offending you. If you're offended, don't read the ad.
Yeah, and if one is offended and if there's a campaign launched to boycott Tanishq, then I think that should be accepted too. That's also freedom of expression, right?
Yeah, boycotts are complicated. The liberal view now is that all boycotts are wrong. I have never accepted that view. For instance, apartheid ended in South Africa because there was a boycott in South Africa. So it is your right to launch a boycott. It is your right not to like an ad. Nobody can deny that to you. It's wrong, however, to pull the ad off legally. And as far as I can tell, that wasn't done. Tanishq caved in unnecessarily.
Absolutely. I agree there. I think we've already exceeded 40 minutes of our conversation, but it was amazing speaking to both of you. I know there are many questions that we could have delved into, but we haven't. But given the paucity of time, I think we'll keep it at that. But I want to extract a promise from both of you that whenever there is another issue, fraught issues that we would want to discuss, both of you will be available to come and have a conversation, because this is exactly what I'm trying to do, create a space where contrarian views can sit together in a perhaps very soon with a cup of tea or a coffee, have a conversation and put it out there for public consumption.
Thank you for having us. That was a great conversation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And I think it's so important that we also offer an alternative space to, when I was studying, there used to be this phrase called manufactured consent, Noam Chomsky's phrase, and it was used to talk about how mass media is used to create an artificial consent. I think today mass media is being used to create an artificial divide. And therefore, I think it's so important that manufactured dissent is actually countered with spaces like the one that you are curating.
Thank you. But before I let you go, I remember, Veer, you wanted to ask certain questions from Barkha and me. And Barkha, if you want to ask certain questions to Veer and me, this is, I know that this went on in the form of, me asking questions and both of you responding.
No, I want to ask questions to you. I've asked Barkha everything I want to know already. I don't think she wants to ask me anything.
But I think I keep answering all your pressing questions whenever we meet for coffee, chai, whatever.
Yeah.
And I think you are absolutely cruel and brutal in labeling me a right-wing person and asking all sorts of uncomfortable questions for which I shouldn't technically be answering. Please go ahead.
Shubhrata, I have some questions, but we'll do that the next time we meet for coffee.
Yeah.
All right. Thank
Done.
you.
Done. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And I also hope that you will write to us to explain to us what you feel about the show and what other kind of guests you would want to see on the churn. I also hope that you engage with us on various ideas and keep suggesting on various topics that you would want us to take up in the churn. Till then, take care of yourselves. Do subscribe to our channel. Do spread the word in your network and help us grow. Thank you.